hold the questions at the end. So I'll introduce Katherine Winlaw. Thanks, Katherine.
Hello. And it's interesting to hear Diane's experience because there's certainly some overlap between what she said and what I'll talk about. I wanted to get you involved, though, for just a minute. And if you'll bear with me, I want to ask you all to stand up for a minute, just where you are. And close your eyes, if you will, and point north without hitting your neighbor. Just take a guess. Okay. Can you open your eyes and just look around the room? Thanks. I'll have you sit down. I think, yeah, if I had my compass here, it would be somewhere in that direction. The point of that is how do you get a team of 300 people to head in a cohesive direction when you have no way of communicating with them, at least in a really quick and succinct way? And that was one of the challenges that we were faced with at State Library. Oh, I should work out how to do this first. Oh. Is it the little green button? Oh, okay. I want to make sure I know how to do it. Okay. So State Library has a fabulous business continuity plan, and the ability to respond to and protect the collections, I think, was exceptional. There were still some lessons learned about how we could do things better next time. And for several months, it's interesting, there were many discussions between, I know, senior management and the board about what would happen if the pump room flooded, what would we do? And thankfully, those discussions led to the development of, as I say, a very comprehensive business continuity plan. I'm not going to talk about that, but I'm sure that Grant, who is here, and also Karen Waldock, who is here, who are very much integral to that, would be happy to provide copies and talk to you about the background. What I will say is that the focus of the BCP was very much about protecting the state's assets and ensuring their longevity could be assured through a crisis or a disaster. And as I said, I think we did that brilliantly. But the reasons why we did it so well, I think, in terms of how we responded to the flood, go much deeper than just the plan in place. And more importantly, our response to the flood taught us something about our people, and I think the need to keep people in disaster preparedness. That's just a map of the flood of Brisbane, thanks to Brisbane City Council, and there's a little red box. It's a little bigger than State Library actually is, but it gives you an idea of where we were situated in relationship to the flood. And just at a glance, you'd be forgiven if you look at it and say, well, State Library was relatively untouched. You know, there's just a little bit of blue touching it compared to other neighborhoods like Milton up in the north there or St. Lucia, which were fairly badly hit. And when you go on the tour later, you can probably see the flood mark downstairs. It's just there. There's a little black text marker. And again, when you look at that in relationship to the Christchurch impacts and of the earthquake, I think you'd say it's kind of innocuous. And what in fact, our State Library even here talking about a disaster. But what's not visible is what lay beneath that peak and what it meant to our operations. Our Edge facility was flooded up to level 0. Our car parks were flooded. The Cultural Center power stations that were built on the assumption that they'd be above the flood were damaged. The river pump room, which affects our air conditioning, was flooded. Our loading dock and AV storeroom were all affected. And so to the naked eye, it might look as if, well, when the water receded, you know, you'd be back on deck. But that's kind of where the simple story ends. What happened in terms of this disruption to State Library's operations had a longer term effect. And so while the crisis was declared on the 11th of January, and there were some sort of heroic actions that happened after that. I'll talk about those a bit later. The recovery mode that we went into really went on from January 14th all the way into February for most staff, but for others like the Edge team, they didn't actually get back into their own workplaces until later in April. So whilst on the surface it didn't look like much, and that was interesting because we certainly had lots of public coming around gazing over fences. We had fencing all along the cultural precinct wondering, why aren't you open? Why aren't you open? And the other interesting thing is to think about, that's a map of the greater Brisbane area and the flood itself. And when you think about the impact the flood had not just on South Bank and the South Bank operations, but all throughout the city, if you imagine our staff living throughout that wider district, so many of our staff were affected by the flood in many different ways. And each one had a story. Each one had a story in terms of whether their own homes were flooded or whether they were out of, their power and electricity was out for days, whether their schools were closed, whether their child care centres were closed, whether family members were affected. And when we have a large workforce of about 300 people, that's including casuals, you multiply that effect and it's obviously quite significant. And it's within that context that we have to really think about planning for disaster response and recovery, because a bit like Jenny said, what you might expect of people under normal circumstances doesn't necessarily transpire when things change in their own worlds. And we have to be cognizant of that and I think sensitive to it when disaster does hit. As I said before, we've got a great business continuity plan and it's what got us through the flood. And the BC team developed it and looked at many business processes and business functions, and so we've got plans for security systems and telephones and networks and servers and internet service data storage, public access computers for pest control, for monitoring, humidity controls. All those sorts of things are very well documented. But what the research and experience shows us is that BCP plans tend to be very business and technology driven, thinking about how we protect the assets and how we get back up and running. But sometimes what gets overlooked, I think, are the people side of that disaster. And let me tell you that when you factor people into those plans, there are some amazing things that they do that I don't think careful consideration or thoughtful planning is necessarily going to help us to document. In fact, it was interesting. Someone said to me a couple of weeks ago, one of my colleagues asked me to talk, and someone said, well, you're not on the BCP team. What are you doing there? What are you talking about this issue for? And I think it's a good question because I had no formal role. And in fact, at the time we had January, most people on holiday. We had an acting state librarian. We had a chair of the BCP team that was on holiday. We had the person who had written the plan and worked so diligently with people on leave. We had a communications manager not even in place. She was coming on board 2 days later. So everyone, or many people around the table at the very front end of that crisis and disaster were, in some ways muddling in the dark. And yes, you can read the plan and you can, take account of what it says, but I think most people who've been in any sort of disaster would probably relate to this, that events don't unfold hour by hour, but minute by minute. And there's so many different pieces of information that are flying around at any one time. And making a decision in that situation is really largely a part of some of the people involved in some of the decision points and the decision processes, I think, that you have in place. Some of the early decision points that the team who were involved had to face were actually making the call about when is a crisis a crisis. The plan is really built around what would happen if we were to flood. And if you looked at the government indicators and you looked at the river levels and how they were being monitored, it would say that we were going to be okay. We were going to be okay, that the plans had assumed that we were well above the flood. But what was interesting is there were lots of other indicators. If you looked at the police website, in fact, I wish, Kim, we'd seen those pictures, if she's still here, of it was at Charlton, the flood levels rising so quickly. If we'd seen that earlier, it might have given us a different story. We had staff members who were monitoring the daily unfolding of what was going on through informal channels, looking at the cars proceed over the bridge at rapid pace was somewhat alarming. And yet at the same time, the official stance was things were okay and we didn't really need to worry. It was interesting because when the crisis management team met at, I think it was 12 o'clock that day, and had a further update in terms of river levels and what would happen, there was a fairly bold decision to make about whether to keep State Library opened or closed. Now, we had, public in the building. We had to worry about their safety. We had to think about the impact on the government. And at that stage, whilst part of the government was saying everything's fine, there was a decision made that, no, it really was something that was going to impact on us and that we needed to take probably a proactive approach. And it's interesting in some of the discussions about, throwing policy out the window at the time of crisis, because the decision was made at 1 p.m. that, yes, in fact, we would close that day at 4. Lucky for us that only 2 hours later, the Premier and Cabinet made that same decision and asked that all of South Bank be closed. But I think making that call is something that isn't necessarily just driven by a business continuity plan, but by a number of pieces of information from lots of different sources. The other sort of early decision point was around, safety first. We've got a safety on site that always comes first, and our facilities manager is pretty passionate about that, and no one came on site without being trained. But the other consideration is also thinking about, are staff okay? Are they okay in terms of the impact of the floods in their own life? And as a bit like Diane was saying, are they strong enough to attend to work? Are they strong enough to be able to cope with even getting to work? And so those sorts of things are important. The other one was an interesting decision point about what's essential to carry on with. Over the course of a number of days, there were different things transpiring in terms of not only the power, but the telephones and the lifts. And so making a decision about who to bring back into the building when that might be a possibility was something we had to prepare for, even though it was never exactly clear at what stage the building might be able to be occupied. So what might be essential services in one situation, in another situation, may not be. And what we found is thinking about not only what's essential, but also what might be meaningful for people to do if they wanted to work, because there were certainly lots of people who did want to work once the building was able to be occupied. The other one was really where to work, and it's interesting because I think that was reflected in both Jenny and Diane's conversations, that the idea of work doesn't necessarily have to be where the building is in a crisis, and being prepared for that and thinking about what other alternatives there might be. We had a meeting with a group of managers at one stage and put together, one person volunteered to put together a whole range of options in terms of where people could meet if they wanted to get their teams together. And, it ranged from cafes to Brisbane City Council meeting rooms to some of our partners' boardrooms. So it was fairly wide-ranging. And then the cleanup and recovery phase was, I think, extremely well orchestrated and well thought through, and Grant's certainly to be commended for that. One of the the lessons in terms of the support for people is that we had an enormously passionate group of people who wanted to protect the assets, and there was a sense of almost overwork and looking at how we ensure that people are supported through that process and encouraged to take some downtime for themselves is really important. And then the last decision point was really about bringing people back to work. And I say 1, 2, 3 because it was never everyone walked back into the building. The first stage of it was really we were allowed about 50 people back on the Monday. I think it was after the flood peak. And deciding, who that would be and what they would be doing and monitoring them carefully and making sure that they all had safety training before they came back in. But what we basically worked on, the premise was that it would be driven by some options in terms of options for meaningful work. So looking at not only what essential services might need to be delivered in a very scaled down operation of having only 50 people on site, but also what options individuals would want to engage in. So many of the managers talked to then each of their teams, and this was basically by phone tree, which I'll talk about a little later, but asking them, what their intentions were, whether it was to take leave or to take flex or to come back if they wanted to work, what sorts of things they might want to help out with. And here were a range of some of those options. So in some cases, people weren't coming back to work to do what they normally did. We had public programs people who obviously couldn't put on public programs in a building that was unsafe for the community, not only for our staff, but for community. So one of the interesting, I think, things in terms of the whole decision-making, especially in crisis, is there's some impediments that we face, and one of them is just bringing people together. It's much easier to bring people together to make some decisions quickly, and that was possible and doable for the crisis management team through that period, but even bringing the managers together to make some decisions about priorities in terms of some of the workloads and who would help out who was difficult. The other is just the lack of information and conflicting ideas, and I go back to that exercise at the beginning in terms of even just getting a common agenda about which way is north in a room like this is challenging. Imagine what it's like to try and get information about what is important to do right now given a certain set of circumstances. And the other is just the time pressures placed on people to make those decisions is often quite pressing. And so our ability to make accurate decisions is difficult. And when you couple that with the fact that by nature our ability to perceive is selective. And so it's important, I think, that we factor that into our decision making about how we respond to disasters, because expecting that things will go to a plan and that it will be something easy to do in terms of a tick-the-box exercise is never quite the reality. This set of points came from an interesting lecture I was at from a emeritus professor, Nurkum, who is at the UQ School of Psychiatry, and he talks about how doctors diagnose issues in an emergency situation. And I think it's really relevant to us as people as we deal with disasters and crises that we will never have all the bits of information we want. Wanting to know exactly where the flood would peak and exactly what impact it would have obviously drove much of our thinking around how we would respond. But sometimes we don't have all those pieces of information, and being cognizant of that and being willing to entertain the fact that things will be unpredictable is really important. And the other is that you can only ever make a guess, but be curious about that guess. And that's coupled, I think, with the other point about paying attention to late evidence. I think certainly on the day that we made the decision to close the library, the late evidence was that there was certainly a stream of cars going across the bridge, and that there was something else happening that we might not have been seeing just in the media releases or the press releases or the communication with AQ. And that, coupled with, obviously, there was a lot of other detail that went into that decision, not just cars going across the freeway, let me tell you. But I think it's important that it's pulling a whole lot of information together. And remembering that crises are dynamic, and that they're only ever, we can only ever make decisions at a freeze frame in time, and we may have to reassess those decisions constantly. And again, unless you want to have a business continuity plan that's 180 pages long, preparing for every one of those different scenarios would be extremely difficult. I think that the core thing is building a team that has lots of different perspectives that are attuned to lots of different pieces of information is probably the most critical thing in terms of being prepared for and coping with different disasters. The other thing I just wanted to say is that there's a model, and it's interesting because this is built around IBM's thinking about the human side of business continuity planning. And there's some research that the Society for Human Resources did that said that, I think I mentioned earlier, most plans don't take into account the people side of the plan. And it's interesting because when I saw this some months ago, it really did capture some of the things that we had to deal with as we moved through not only the early decision making, but also the later recovery stages. And I think in some ways stumbled onto some of the issues and we dealt with them effectively. But it would be nice to have, I think, some structure in place in terms of the people side of some of the response and the preparedness. So some of the things that we had to deal with in terms of people attending work was just this issue of, are they safe at home? As I said earlier, they had their own personal lives to deal with. And so the teams that might be identified to be in a recovery team may not be the team that's available on that particular day because they literally can't get there. And the other one was about having backup locations for people to work from, that, being prepared that the building itself may not be available, and having the locations and the desks and the equipment identified as well. So in one case, we had a team that normally works here at the South Bank building that went out to the Cannon Hill office and getting the desks set up and the equipment set up for them before they could actually come in to work. The other one was just the safety on site and just the enormous amount of work and effort it takes to manage the people who are in the building on the day through that period where it was very limited access. And that takes, I think, a lot of effort, and people, doing that on top of what might be a significant workload in terms of the facilities management, that sort of thing. So having some people identified to carry that on. And then thinking about the transport and people's ability to actually get into work. So in some cases we had people having to attend work at Cannon Hill who don't normally take transport there, and having some allowances for then managing through those changes, I think, is important. The other one was really about maintaining our services and knowing what essential services are. We often have a debate internally around, what is core business, and the issue about the essential services and not so much a reflection on what contribution an individual makes, although in some cases I think that was people's reaction. If I'm not considered essential, does that mean that I'm no longer important? And it's really about what's essential at this point in time in terms of the facilities and the capabilities we have. And also thinking about who can step in and help out and other opportunities that are available. So in the case of State Library, we took the opportunity to leverage off some other partnerships, and there were lots of other projects that were able to be undertaken outside the confines of the library. The EDGE visitor services officers, who had no really location to work from, started working with the community and collecting some stories of people affected by the flood. The corner staff, who are involved in children and literacy programs, worked with Brisbane City Council libraries. The ICT staff were hard at work in terms of getting almost 200 people on Citrix and able to work from home. The collection preservation team were working with some staff at State Archives. So working with some of our partners, I think, was really beneficial. And then just redeploying some staff to some other projects that might not get done under normal circumstances. And that included some of the stock take at our Cannon Hill operations, restructuring some of the storage of newspapers at Cannon Hill, and having 9 heritage staff that got involved in terms of appraising 120 boxes of glass plate negatives that would then be selected for digitization that helped to increase the accessibility of many of those items. So there were lots of opportunities that presented themselves through the fact that we couldn't access all parts of the building. The other key thing that we had to deal with was just the employee contact and the importance of being able to contact all employees. We had set up an 1-800 number for staff, and when our phones went down, that was affected. And then what happened was, because it was put on the website, we were unable to pass some internal messages to staff through that hotline because the public were able to access it. So we had to depend on the old-fashioned, phone tree, which, as I think Diane was saying earlier, learning that we really needed to have everyone's mobiles and everyone's home phone numbers accessible to all managers, and keeping that up to date was really critical. And we learned through the process, and we got better and sharper, and learning to send out massive text messages to people as opposed to the phone tree. So there was lots of, I think, learnings along the way. The other one for me was knowing what HR policies especially might be important in a crisis. And we are part of the public sector, and so there are many of those things that are determined for us. But there were also, I think, some lessons in terms of sometimes pushing those boundaries and making some decisions that we thought were most appropriate. One of them was around the special leave and the access to special leave, and also the access for our casuals to pay and the traveling to and from work. So having some of those things tidied up and in place and thinking them through is just a good thing to have at hand, I think. The other one in that the model is around the internal support, and I mentioned about the communicating with staff, but the thing that stands out the most for me is really the importance of having a facility for questions and that two-way flow of information. I think we worked hard at trying to get consistent information out to all staff about what was happening at least every day or every other day through that early recovery period. But in many cases, they had questions, and so the timeliness of then feeding that back through managers and then getting answers back to them was at times cumbersome and probably frustrating for staff. And there have been some improvements since then in terms of the plans around having a Gmail account in the cloud for managers, and about 40 key staff who can then access and contribute and communicate with each other through some of those periods. But I certainly think there's probably something more we can do in terms of creating that exchange of information so people feel definitely connected and heard, because that sense of uncertainty and wanting to know what's going on, I think permeated definitely the early weeks of our own experiences. And the other point there is around just ensuring there's support for staff. Again, as Diane said, everyone responded to the floods very differently, and having employee advisory service for staff set up so that they can access that, whatever their circumstances might be, because what I do know is that everyone had quite different circumstances. And the other point was just about the pays. It was a big issue for people in terms of, if I'm not being called into work, will I be paid? Will I get access? And the really important thing about that was that we've got a large group of casuals that we depend on and that depend on us. And, under many circumstances, you'd say, well, it's a casual person and there's no work, why pay them? But, in circumstances outside their control and when we really want to encourage loyalty and commitment, looking after them, I think, is extremely important. Having said that, it's got to be done in the context of the public service and not going too far to the extreme that the public would say, what on earth are you paying people for if they're not working? So many of those things, I think, just can be summed up in terms of, looking at those key aspects of the people side of the impact of the disaster and recovery work, and what would happen if staff can't get home? What would we have done if we hadn't made that decision as early as we did, and people may not have been able to get home. We knew on the day of the 11th there were many roads that were being closed, and so what's our obligation to people in that case? If they can work and they can work from home, have we got all the systems and processes in place to make that easy for them? If they do stay at work, what obligations have we got if they're working from home? We had, Karen, you can probably correct me if I'm wrong, but it would have been close to 200 people that were working from home for at least some weeks. And, what are our obligations in that case? And to what extent do we need to provide coverage and support for them? And then just the issue of the services and what's essential, and building some sort of hierarchy and prioritization level, and looking at different people who can help in different capacities, not just in terms of doing their own role, but doing other roles that people might need in that situation. I think just lastly, I'd want to touch on some of the lessons of the flood in our daily lives. And I think one of the things that stood out really prominently for me is that people cared. Our staff cared about each other. We had the public care about us. We had staff caring significantly about the public library staff, and looking at what had happened to each one of them in terms of their own experiences. And this idea of creating a sense of purpose. I think the willingness of people to come in and help to clean out the car parks and some of the, I'll show you some of the pictures a bit later, some of the muddy areas can only be, I think, attributed to the fact that they felt like they were creating and contributing to something that was a bit greater than just themselves. The other one was this idea of a relevance quotient, and encouraging people to see that just because the work that they do under normal circumstances might not be able to be undertaken in a disaster doesn't necessarily, or in a disaster situation, a disaster recovery situation, doesn't necessarily mean that they themselves are not relevant. And the last one is just this need for connection. And it's interesting because there's some research you might have heard about in terms of neuroscience, and David Rock has done some work around the SCARF model, and it says that when we are faced with a threat, that we react in ways that, and these are my words, impact on our intelligence, quite frankly, and that if we can manage some of the aspects that people need in terms of any threat situation, and he attributes those to status, so encouraging and trying to maintain people's status, trying to bring a sense of certainty to the situation, encouraging people to be autonomous, ensuring that there's some sense of relatedness and fairness are really important. And I think what I could see in terms of the flood event is that whole disruption to people's social networks and just coming to work and being together certainly accounts for some of the stress levels in any event. So being sure that and encouraging us all to keep connected and stay related, and whether that's having meetings in the cafe shops and bringing people up to speed, or connecting with them via the telephone in the early stages is really important, and throughout the follow-on periods as well, because what happened in our situation is, as some people were returning, there were still other people who were working from home, and that sense of relatedness for them, obviously, was a key issue. Just the last point I want to make is that at the end of the day, I don't think any plan can really create enough certainty for every scenario and every twist and turn that any disaster is going to present to us. And as I said earlier, I think our ability to respond the way we did was definitely rooted in our people. And some of these stories, I think, just give a sense of the different aspects and the different perspectives people took throughout the flood. And the one, actually this isn't the first one, but in many cases, I think I've already mentioned, some people were working from South Bank, some people were working for home. What I didn't highlight is that it was extremely hot and humid January conditions with no air conditioning, which for Queenslanders is a big issue. Many people took the opportunity to volunteer with Red Cross, with their local church, with the evacuation center, helping family and friends, and so there was the ability to take some leave and do just that. But many made do without power for weeks from their own homes. They had to relocate their families temporarily, their offices, their children into new schools and into new child care centers. The story that sort of resonates with most people here is the one where a group of very dedicated staff were given a call at, the facilities manager, Greg, was given a call at 1:30 on the morning of Wednesday, the 12th, and told that, in fact, SLQ, the pump room, would be flooding. And so he gathered a team of people together at 1:30 in the morning, where there was no electricity, and had to relocate much of the edge equipment from the lower floors up above where the floodwaters were expected to come. And it's just interesting in terms of, the individual's experience in that, where they worked to exhaustion in the middle of the night. This went on for nearly 9 hours. I don't think you could have written that into any plan and given someone that role. The other stories about the ICT team and having to pull down, if I've got this right, pull down a server and prepare it in a circumstance that would normally take 6 to 8 hours, and they did that in 90 minutes. Again, I don't think a plan would necessarily condone that. We had teams of people in the heritage collections and collection access area moving trolley loads of material from downstairs, upstairs into safer space. And, having to do this in sort of tedious and very hot conditions. In other cases, we had some staff from our heritage collections area thinking about what collections would we need to actually collect from the greater Queensland community. And this particular individual, Serena, had her eyes on the Premier's speech, and in fact was able to make sure that we got a copy of that. And I think that's extraordinary as well, because at the same time this individual's having to deal with their own personal circumstances. This is just a quote from one of the staff who worked with the Mud Army in Brisbane, and I think the most telling part is where he says, "I met a couple from China who were there to help with the cleanup on their honeymoon. They agreed it would be a memorable honeymoon," and got a round of applause on the return bus. But like many others, I couldn't help but hope that the spirit of selflessness and cooperation would carry into our everyday lives. That's also not mentioning the teams that did all the hard yakka and the cleanup downstairs. And I just want to say that, at the end of the day, I think the preparedness of our people to, rise to the occasion and pull in where needed was extraordinary. And I think those complicated scenarios that unfold, over especially the early days and weeks, probably couldn't have been foreseen in any plan, although there are some things that we would certainly learn from the experience and hope to bring forward into our future. So thank you very much.